Hi, afternoon. It's Matthew Holt. It is just past 1 o'clock, running a bit late today because of Los Angeles traffic. Who's got to blame Los Angeles traffic for everything? Uh, um, but anyway, I have the regular Thursday edition of the JCB Gang, a little special on here with a special guest. We were going to have join us Casey Quinlan, but she's having a bad Met day, so it's been told by her doctor to rest. So we have to miss Casey, but we have one of our good friends as our guest. And I have our regulars, John at Neptune, JL Neptune, CEO of Suntra Modern Recovery, and Lygeia Ricciardi, who these days is CEO of AdaRose, but back in the day used to be head of consumer stuff at ONC. But actually, that's dating you sometime now, Lygeia. So
Right.
now a budding young entrepreneur who's and will tell us a bit more about what she's been doing because she just graduated from her first accelerator. Probably first of many, given how and JL used to run an accelerator, so it all works out. All right, fantastic. So let's quickly start off, go around the horn. I'll ask everyone what they've been up to, what they've been noticing the last week or so, and then I'll introduce Andrea a bit, talk a bit about the Light Collective. We'll talk a bit about some of this data stuff that has been causing a little bit of fuss and may yet cause more, but also find out what everyone else is up to. All right, so JL, why don't I start with you? What have you been looking at?
I'm still buzzing about the One Medical Amazon acquisition. I think that is really one of the most significant events in the history of digital health. I have always argued that our space to see true change in healthcare, that change wouldn't be affected by a college kid in a dorm room. I have always felt you need to come at this space with big guns and big resources, and there's really no bigger guns out there than Amazon. And I think that Amazon looks at a healthcare space that is very inefficient and really ripe for rethinking or at least a pillaging in some way, right? So I think that, I'm very excited about the One Medical acquisition. I know the founder, Tom Lee, pretty well, so I think that's a very significant event. And I'm really interested in what they're going to do and how they're going to stitch together different types of resources, their pill pack stuff, lots of other, I'm sure, assets that we don't even know about that they're going to combine to hopefully a great product. And by the way, I'm a One Medical customer and I love it. I use it on a regular basis. So I'm interested in seeing it grow further.
I look forward to Amazon pushing you and me and my wife and your wife around the way they may need to do it. When we'll see how that works out. I'm interested. We should chat about that. We did have we had a special session with Jeff Goldsmith, Jess the Master, and Dan O'Neill on that last week. But that will run and run. We're not going to hear the end of that for some time. Lygeia, you've been busy. I've been tracking your emails about what your new gig. So tell us a bit about your new gig and what you've been doing, and then tell us what you've been looking at.
Sure. So my new gig is called AdaRose. It's named after one of my daughters. And the story behind that is it's about engagement in health. If for those of you who may know me way back from ONC days, when she was very little, basically when she was born, she had a hole in her heart. She had a ventricular septal defect, and we were told that she needed immediate open heart surgery. And I was working with a whole lot of patient advocates at the time. And I thought, wait a minute, I think I need to ask some questions and look for some alternatives and gather some data. So I did all those things. And long story short, found another institution and a terrific doctor who helped us, my husband and me, manage a kind of watch and wait approach, again, based on ongoing data measurement, et cetera. So that was awesome. But the moral of that story for me was a thank you to all the patient advocates who helped me think differently. And also, it's just incredibly important, of course, to be engaged in your health at whatever level, whether as a patient, caregiver, et cetera. So I want to help people with healthcare and wellness and self-care broadly, and AdaRose is born of that. We did just graduate from our first accelerator program, the Founder Institute, with a product that helps people do self-care at home, online and off. So I am super excited about that. I will also say, just kind of talking about healthcare in general and what's on my mind. Of course, we've been talking about COVID for like years, and I'm currently quarantining in my basement because my husband upstairs has COVID. We've avoided it till now, but this is like my first within house experience managing it. So I am also very intrigued by the One Medical deal, and I'm also a patient there. It sounds like most of us.
Yeah, they've already got their captive market of difficult consumer types. They need to get. We'll see how they do. Yeah.
And Lygeia, I had COVID for the second time last week, so I empathize with your husband and you.
Oh no. Well, you look
Yes.
well. I
Thank you.
trust you're feeling all better.
Second time wasn't so bad. I had COVID classic in March of 2020, and that was very unpleasant. But the second time around wasn't so bad.
Yeah, I had it. I had it in I want to say May. I also had a cough and a cold, which wasn't COVID. You can get flu-y cough and cold still. I had that when I was on vacation in the East Coast, and I was going to see my somewhat elderly parents-in-law, and I tested myself a bunch, and I was fine. I actually felt much sicker then than I did COVID. COVID was actually lovely for me because it meant I could just shut everyone in my house out of my bedroom and my office. My wife left, my kids weren't allowed in. It was like 6 of the best days. And then I could go out, walking the dogs on my own and stuff, and I could be in the kitchen without them. It was 6 of the best days of my life. I don't think I watched the show. I should talk about that.
Well, I'm carrying trays up to my husband and like feeding him, so he's kind of got it pretty good up there.
Yeah. There was some trays shoved through the door. I basically said to them, I have a big enough place I can sit. My kitchen and my bedroom are the same level, so I can send them all downstairs and say, don't come bother me while I'm making dinner, and I'll take the dogs out for a walk. And I was in great shape so I finally tested negative again. All right. So let me introduce, because we have a little bit of limited time today because I I was late. So let me introduce Andrea.
Hi.
So Andrea, I'm great to have you on the show. And you are a patient advocate. You best known on Twitter as at Brave Bosom because of the group that you run initially on Facebook, and now you're in charge of the Light Collective. So why don't you start really quickly? Tell us about what happened to the group on Facebook. If we don't know that story, what you discovered regarding Facebook, and then what the Light Collective is all about. And then we can dive into some of the topics around that.
Yeah. So as in the backstory of the BRC sisterhood and the BRCA groups, or okay.
Yeah,
sure.
That.
Sure. We can start with, actually, I'm going to start like even further back. I am sad Casey is not here because she was like, whenever I first showed up to be an advocate when I lived in DC, she's the first person I met, took me under her wing. We're kind of besties in the like advocate e-patient world. And we are going to DEF CON in a week. And we had a pact that, we made it through this far of Met's party. We were going to go celebrate her 70th birthday on the Strip. So yes, I am definitely of the Casey Quinlan, like wild streak kind of lady when it comes to where my advocacy is in the breast cancer community. I am a pre-vivor. I have a BRCA1 mutation and started my advocacy work around data sharing back in 2013 with the case that went to the Supreme Court on whether human genes could be patented. And I had this background in tech. At the time, was really needing social support. And back in the days when Facebook was the privacy aware option to MySpace, a lot of patient groups gravitated towards that platform, which then in turn created a massive network effect for a lot of support groups that still exist there today because there's no alternative. There are the Twitter communities. We can talk a lot about that. But for me, this organization, the Light Collective, really started in 2018 when I began doing some security research. I didn't even know it was security research until I ran into, Matt, we both know the good Fred Trotter. I brought some of my research to him, and turns out the things that I found scaled to all closed groups on Facebook. There were ways to scrape the real names from the group, the history from the group. You can go look at all of that on missingconsent.org if you want to look at that like founding story. But what are we working on today? As I've gone through this path of learning what community needs are for not only digital rights, but also privacy, I have been working towards how do we really build communities on solid ground? How do we find safer places for social support? What are we missing in our current, national laws in terms of health privacy that need to be in place. And, you know, I eventually hope to move towards, I guess, what good looks like for peer support, social support that isn't just owned by a company that can be acquired or do whatever the company wants to monetize the data. There should be some say from the users or the patients in that. And so I guess a lot, Matt calls me a troublemaker. I keep like just ending up in the news, and we end up talking on Twitter about things. And the latest one was IQVIA. There's a whole thing with IQVIA that just happened. And I'm, I guess, in the middle of this big Twitter debate right now with Facebook getting sued for Pixel. So there you go. That's me in a nutshell.
All right, fantastic. Well, let's pick up a couple of threads there, because I think there's a lot that's combining here, right, around patient advocacy, around building a new, whether it's Amazon or whomever, building a big tech company coming and building a new practice in healthcare, and the current existing data practices of healthcare actors and not previously healthcare actors like Facebook and Google and Amazon. So we can pull these threads apart in many ways, but they all obviously interact. And if you start with the fact that Facebook ran into trouble with private groups like yours, there was clearly ways, and there were demonstrated ways, that people actually hacked into private groups, found out who all the members were, exposed the members. The one that I remember the most is a left-wing progressive news organization hacked into a right-wing law enforcement group and found out all the white supremacists. So I'm not particularly I wasn't really upset about the fact that those kind of bad actors they exposed, but obviously that meant any of the the same tools could be used to expose any number of people, including people with who thought they were in a private, mostly anonymous breast cancer group, or people who were gay men in Egypt or whatever, right? So that was the way. Facebook was very reticent to do anything about that. Now they're involved with this issue of many, for reasons that don't seem to be clear, but might seem to be with advertising, many hospitals transmitting some of the data back to them, unknown perhaps to the hospital, certainly unknown to the patients involved. So there's that bucket, right, of sort of external actors. Then we've got the big bucket, and I think we all have our views on this, and this is where sort of IQVIA, which used to be IMS Health, those of us who are old enough remember that, the old IMS Health, which has always been the source of kind of all data in healthcare, and still is. But now has many well-funded competitors, Komodo Health, Clarify, Vasana, the list goes, Innovase, the list goes on. And what they have been doing, and this is where I think it's interesting question, just to be clear, is they've been taking data from various sources. So they've been matching data from, say, an electronic medical record with data from Experian, with, say, data from claims, and maybe data from pharmacy or whatever else, and matching it using a technique called tokenization, which a lot of people don't know existed. Funnily enough, I was in a company which thinks it patented that back in 2000, and then ran out of money before it could enforce it. Actually, pay the lawyer to actually file the remaining patent. So perhaps that that company would have been rich had we realized what was going on. But anyway, the idea is that Andrea Downing's data from an EMR, Andrea Downing's data from a Experian or Ross can all be put together, but the quote unquote HIPAA identifying details such as your name, address, that kind of stuff get scrubbed. They do know it's the same person, and they know a lot about you. Now, there is clearly abilities with those kinds of data sets. If you know enough about the person from other sources and you can find their anonymized but collected data, you can re-anonymize, if you get it. I guess there's a couple. I'll leave that. That essentially that's what IQVIA has been doing for a long time, frankly, has been exposed by Casey Ross in Stat, not exposed, but to describe in Stat. And I guess the question is, you can argue on the one hand, this is, yes, it's probably used for drug companies to market, which is the main way that all health data is used. But this kind of data, is not a million miles away from the kind of data that we look at to sort of further research and do better population health management, et cetera, et cetera. So you can make good arguments for why this isn't a terrible thing, why this might actually work and be useful. And then, the last thing is there are actors who gather this data up. So we had someone from Clarify Health on a few weeks ago, and they actually gather that data in an anonymized fashion up. If they meet a health plan that has the actual data, they can re-identify and link it back together under the auspices of care management.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot going on here, but I'd love to kick it to all three of you and say, is that kind of activity in and of itself bad, in itself good? Or, is it something that's okay so long as we regulate it properly? And what are your general feelings about it? Because, I'm kind of in the camp of saying that if it's regulated properly and done by responsible groups, it's probably okay. But maybe I'm being delusional. So, Andrea, I know you have thoughts, Jay, you have thoughts, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'd be happy to start. Well, I think one of the themes I think about a lot is the weapon depends on the wielder. And what I mean by that is, so Matt, you just shared that story, I'm going to go back to the Facebook group's vulnerability, where that story that exposed police officers who were also in white nationalists or KKK groups, they exploited the vulnerability that we had described to Facebook in terms of ways that it could harm patients. They exploited that vulnerability in chilling precision. And one may argue, yeah, that is a good use of exploiting a vulnerability, right? But then again, the weapon depends on the wielder. I think what we often fail to recognize and what often lies under the surface are ways in which these vulnerabilities are used against patients. Number one, to make money, or to figure out ways to target vulnerable populations with content. And when I say that, I mean specifically target vulnerable patient populations with ads and content that they wouldn't otherwise see. And let me give you some examples here. And I'm still on the Facebook example, but I've learned the ways that you can weaponize surveillance capitalism. And when I say surveillance capitalism, I truly mean the ad targeting model. You can target bourbon ads to alcoholics. You can target, people who, if you have enough information about their psychographic profile, you can know that they have problems with mental illness, and you can target increasingly radicalizing things that are meant to spark their fear, right? Now, let's go back to tokenization, Matt, because you don't have to identify that person like as a real person in order to do those things, in order to target them in ways that may cause them harm. So really clear here that number one theme is the weapon depends on the wielder. And there are a lot of actors there, just like there are good actors. The second thing is I really want to have a dialogue around really unpacking or making sure that we separate this idea of surveillance capitalism from good uses of population data, because they're totally separate. When we say surveillance capitalism, we're talking about how we monetize data through targeting ads and how we use data to sell kind of to data brokers or to the highest bidder to create predictive profiles that are really not apparent to the end user. That's totally different in, at least from my point of view. You guys may disagree, and I'd love to hear what everybody else thinks, but to me, that's totally different from thinking about the good uses of data that we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, where we got to see a dashboard of what's going on in a population. There are definitely good uses of data for, and have been for a long time with IQVIA. But when we get to the weapon dependent on the wielder part, it's, well, there are also ways that you could say, depending on somebody's financial profile and their health profile, how do we deny services to those groups? How do we only cherry pick the groups of, or the populations of people that are going to make a hospital the most money? And make sure that those services are most available to them. So I'm curious to know what everybody else thinks.
JL, you live in a world now of extremely vulnerable people. And obviously you've been thinking about this data sim for a long time. What's your take?
Sure. So Andrea and Lygeia, I'm the CEO of a company called Suntra Modern Recovery. We provide addiction treatment services for families and individuals. So, we are very attuned to the privacy concerns associated with that, right? And we actually do a bit of Google Ads work to try to find our target customer. And, for anybody who's advertising on Google Ads, there's this whole, as anything around related to addiction, there's this whole other level of certification that you have to go through. They really examine what you're doing because there's been so much abuse in the space. So my general feeling is that I think if we ever want to get to a truly modern healthcare system, we need to think about ways to have a fluidity of data flow, right? And so much of why I think most people experience, or one of the ways in which people experience healthcare, negative outcomes in healthcare, is that their data is just not available to all the different providers who need to interact with that patient, right? And for any of us who have been involved in the care of a sick person, and Matthew knows the story quite well. My mother was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2013. My dad's diagnosed with a brain tumor in the same year. The amount of work that I had to do to manage that data and get it around to all the different people, I mean, it really was very expensive to me and really to us, and really resulted in, I think, poorer outcomes than we might have had otherwise. So I'm a strong believer that we've got to figure out how to have that data sloshing around. But at my core, I believe that many, many people who want to use this data are willing to use it for nefarious purposes and are very different from those of us who trained in an academic medical center. So I'll step back a little bit. If you're trained at a doctor, you're trained at an academic medical center, like every single day they're telling you, if you make a mistake and reveal this patient's data, you are going to go to jail forever. You're going to get a life sentence. So for those of us in medicine, we are very cautious about how we share data. And again, in a way that I think is counterproductive, and again, leads to poorer outcomes, poorer care. I think on the other side, you have this whole tech universe of people who are like, hey, this is just data and we can monetize it and we can sell it. And actually we can make a lot of data if we sell this, or make a lot of money if we sell this data. And if we use it for sometimes increasingly concerning ways. So, I think maybe what we need to do is, yes, provide a framework for data fluidity, but we've got to start to, I think, transplant the medical concepts and the medical culture of, like, this is sensitive data and it has to be treated in that way. And if it's not treated in that way, there are going to be severe penalties for you for misusing this data. And again, like, I don't trust Facebook as far as I would never put anything healthcare related on Facebook. The vast majority of tech companies, I would never trust them with data. And actually, to look at One Medical and the Amazon acquisition, I put out a tweet about this. One of my big concerns is, like, what is Amazon going to be doing with data that's flowing from One Medical to your Prime account to your, I'm concerned about that. So, I think it's a challenge and an opportunity, but something that it is very clear that we have a lot of work to do to understand how to make data available and still protect people in the way that they need to be protected.
Before we go to Lygeia on this, just want to, so neither of you mentioned the sort of the re-identification part, which everyone is the bogeyman. I've got the big data set. I've put together enough about Andrea from 6 different sources that I can figure out she's a woman of this age living in Portland with this condition. There are only like 3 of you, and I can figure out how to sort of back into that from other sources. My sense is that isn't that big a deal unless Andrea wants to be identified. Now, there are a bunch of technologies coming to market, and I'm semi-involved with a couple of them that allow. There are a bunch already on the market. I'm working with Joy Bosa and other ex-Health 2.0 like JL and me to Pluto Health, but there are a bunch of others, who will basically allow you to go and find your data from all the EMRs that now have open APIs. We're talking about, finally, we've opened this is the stuff Lygeia was working on a decade ago, finally getting somewhere. But, and then there's the next set, which is now we know there's a lot of data out there about you, in Experian and elsewhere. And if you tell those data sources a little bit more about you, they might be able to give you something you might want. They might be able to include in the clinical trial you like. They might be able to give you some kind of service you can get access to before. And there's a whole bunch of people who are playing around with that area as well. And don't forget, there are databases out there that know a lot about you. If you've ever gone to JFK to get on a plane and have forgotten your ID, which I have done once, you will get asked a bunch of questions by the TSA guy in a separate area, which I was, and they know a hell of a lot about where you live. They ask it, and they can ask you a bunch of questions that you ought to know, but not a normal person wouldn't know, to say, figure out if you're a spy or not, or a terrorist or whatever. So we know that data is out there in the world, whether it's military or spook or what have you. But I'm just to clarify, yes, there's a lot of concern about advertising and nefarious actors. There's good reasons for having data for population health and maybe individual health. And there's this sort of gray area in the middle. But it doesn't sound like you're too concerned about sort of re-identification of the tokenized data, Andrea, by the IQVIAs of the world.
Oh, I absolutely am. And okay. I think what I often go back to is the use of those data specifically for predictive algorithms. So, we talk about how data brokers can develop profiles from all these different sources and analytics about an individual. And my question becomes, to what end? If I don't have all of those data sources amassed about myself in order to inform my own care or my own decisions, how are those data being used about me, without me? That's the very common thing in the e-patient movement. As a person, you have to keep in mind where I came from originally. What is my patient story? My life literally changed at 25 years old because of a predictive algorithm. I was told at 25 that I had up to an 87% chance of developing breast cancer and up to a 60% chance of developing ovarian cancer in my lifetime. To get to that number, you had to get my genotype, you had to get my family history, you had to get my phenotype, and all these other things kind of pulled together what we think my risk of cancer is. And even with the best data at the time, those numbers have drastically changed from when I first got that test result. So herein lies the rub. When we talk about predicting people's behavior, predicting people's health, predicting people's futures based on analytics, we could re-identify people and give a full picture of what somebody is doing, or what we might predict about a person based on these different data sources or real world data. The question is, as data science evolves, how much is that being used to determine the choices we have available to us, and sometimes life or death decisions about us without us even knowing about it. And a few very specific examples that I think are good to point to are, Matt, you shared the pain prediction algorithm, the opioid prediction algorithm, which is, there's a broker who has a whole bunch of data that they put together in order to decide whether or not you are at risk of being addicted to opioids. And if you're in a hospital and you're in pain, they may or may not give you pain medication based on that. And you don't know where that data came from. You don't know if it is accurate. You don't even know if the predictive algorithm is based on good, solid, statistics, data science. Another one that I think is a really good use case to point to is the sepsis predictions and this was actually a Casey Ross thing in Epic. Epic has about 25 predictive algorithms on various things, whether or not you're going to develop sepsis and other types of things. And those are drawn from different sources, whether it's in your EMR or other things. We don't know what's in those data sets. We don't know the quality of the data, and we don't know how those calls were made because they are literally black box or proprietary algorithms that aren't subject to independent review. And there, for me, lies the point. If you are re-identifying a person and pulling in data to make decisions about a person, you better make sure it's really accurate, grounded in good science, and independently verifiable if you're going to make life or death decisions about me in my care. Or if you're going to make decisions about whether I am eligible for health benefits, or if I'm eligible to get a mortgage. More and more, we're starting to see While these things may be legal or not, the incredible lack of enforcement is leading to a lot of these data brokers just using whatever data they want to decide how opportunities are presented to us. I think that's a problem.
And I just add that, a lot of that stuff, yes, you can imagine litigation or tokenization, voluntary or involuntary, known or unknown, run into that problem, but also the issue about what's in the algorithm, what is the algorithm really doing.
Mhm.
I think it's called Bamboo Health now. It used to be called APRIS, the people who have all the data about the
Bamboo Health. That was just, yeah.
Yeah, Bamboo Health, their new name. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the data looked like some of those people were mixing up data about somebody taking, having their dog with an opioid or something and it going to the same address. And there was some data in there that was clearly somewhat dubious. Lygeia, I wanted to drag you in on this because obviously you've been looking widely at consumer health for a long time.
Okay.
That was kind of back in the day, when Regina Benjamin and
so even before that day, Matthew, I don't know if you remember this, but I think it was around maybe 2008, I don't know. I submitted a blog post to the healthcare blog. I didn't know you didn't know
I
me.
remember all 2008.
It was about privacy. And it was basically sort of related to this issue because it was highlighting not just let's fight about issues with who has access to data right now or not, but this problem that the amount of data about us is going to be exponentially greater over time. And that has proven to be true. And it will continue to be true, such that I think even if a few years from now, when we look at this problem again, it'll be like, oh, this is even worse because there are cameras everywhere and there's more data sensors in everything, sort of pulling in new data. So this is an incredibly important problem. And I've thought about it for a long time. Like JL, and I think like all of us, I am passionately, deeply committed to the idea that data needs to flow in order to have a whole lot of critical things happen. At the same time, it can flow in bad ways or be used for bad purposes. So what do you do about it? Sort of what struggles or what I struggle with is that policy is always slower than technology, no matter what. And that is often for good reasons. I mean, you don't want to be rewriting policies every day or laws or anything like that. Technology is changing really quickly, so it is inherently a challenge. I would tend to agree with where I think a couple of you were headed, which is that the data is going to flow. It's not even on the table to be like, oh, we're not going to re-identify data, or we're not going to share data, or we're not going to collect data. That cow is so far out of the barn, and it's going to keep charging down the meadow. So what do we do? How do we put in place policies that address some of these issues? I think they have to do loosely with things like transparency and credit reports. When you think about Experian and all those other ways that you can kind of get your financial reports, right? You're allowed to get a copy of it once a year or whatever it is. You can at least check in and see what's up, what data about me is there. I would love to see something like that for health for a variety of reasons. But I'd also like to see some transparency about the black box of the algorithm. I don't know what that looks like, but I think it's important. I don't know if there's I hate to say an IRB type process or something, but there's got to be something that looks into these things. And I also feel like it's important that it not just be from a health angle, like the way HIPAA has been, what is health data and what isn't, because I don't even know anymore what health data is, right? I mean, honestly. So very high level, my thoughts are it's got to be in sort of regulation or policy, maybe created by the private sector to some extent. And it's got to have elements of transparency. And yeah, I mean, it's also a really sticky, messy, awful problem. So yeah, I'd love to get more thoughts from you guys on what the specifics of the how might be. I think we all agree, what a nasty problem.
I'd argue that there's a couple of things. One is we need a new HIPAA, well, not HIPAA, but something,
something broader.
There was something, there's
Yes.
parts in cures, right? There's a little bit of a GDPR, which is not applicable to America directly, but we will get those really annoying, every time you get on a website now and ask you about cookies, which hopefully are going away apparently. And then there's something to be said for, not only the wielder of the weapon, as Andrea says, but also where the battlefield, the weapon has been wielded on, if you like, because there is something that's care, there is something that's advertising, there is stuff that's fraud, right? There's stuff that's outright. You talk a lot about why a healthcare record is so valuable in the black market. I don't think it's because of what's the health data in it. It's because you can start generating personas and start building both, Medicare and Medicaid and private plans. And every day with the DOJ press releases, they've caught some other dubious actor in Florida, rounding up homeless people and allegedly, doing surgery on them or whatever and billing the taxpayer, right? And we know that's an ongoing big problem. But to go back to like the advertising, you could imagine a set of regulatory requirements in a law that kind of do what Google is in somewhat doing the jail with Suntra Modern Recovery. We're saying if you are going to advertise, you can only do it in this way to these people for these things, and you can't sell bourbon to alcoholics or God knows crystal meth to whatever the next degradation of that is. So I think that is the case. And by the way, quick topical thing on HIPAA. When Devin McGraw was on here a couple of months back, I got her going on this topic. And when you get one of the nation's leading advocates for or the leading privacy lawyers in health on this, and she was discussing the impact of legal subpoenas on HIPAA, which are an easy way to break HIPAA. And imagine that you're in a state which is now banning abortions, and an abortion provider or a healthcare provider was faced with a subpoena on a particular woman's medical records. That's not invulnerable to HIPAA either. So there's more to be done in terms of what HIPAA is doing now. But I think extending HIPAA, because as you said, Lygeia, we now have a world of sensors in the bedroom, the bathroom, and around the house, which are more and more going to be. I was looking at some data. I think, Joe, you shared this on LinkedIn of the increase in remote patient monitoring under Medicare, up by a factor of 6 or 7 in the last few years, a couple of years since it started paying for it. That's going to continue. So we've got to get all that stuff in there. And then we have to have a real agreement about, I think, transparency of what's in the data and your ability to go check the data and your ability for your agent, whoever it may be, because real people aren't going to go do this. It's going to be consumer advocates on their behalf, as you guys know. Ability for you to at least look at the algorithm. And that's going to be very touchy because a lot of people think that is a private proprietary algorithm, which is their business advantage. But, if it's something like it's stopping you getting drugs or it's, pushing you towards one treatment or away from another treatment, I think, people are going to have to look at that. And there's a lot of sort of around the ethics of AI in that. And then, the last part I think is going to be is that, under what circumstances can you control and opt in and opt out? The problem is if you said everybody, you've got to opt into everything, no one opts in, right? This is back to where this is kidney donations for people with driver's license. If you say, the countries that say, yeah, you have to opt out, have like 95% of people saying, I'm not going to bother opting out. The countries say, well, you have to opt in to give your kidneys away, have like 5-10% of people have a massive kidney shortage. And the same thing will be true with data. So I kind of get where the law should go, but I'm also, just to the tag, I'm great that the stat is running this series because not enough people know about what's going on now. And there's, if IQVIA is doing good business, the right thing, they shouldn't, at least they talk to him in the second article. The first article, they wouldn't talk to him. At least then he couldn't introduce tokens because he couldn't get them on the record. He does have them sort of on the record in the second article, so I hope there's more. But that's I think my sort of overview for what, I'm not sure it's a how, it's a what. I don't know how we get there.
Yeah, I just also want to throw in though that I'm super concerned about the last mile, which is sort of education, communication, understanding by the general population. Because again, I hate to go back and highlight what a nightmare the whole issue around vaccination, mask wearing. It's not just a matter of presenting facts anymore. Politics gets so messed up with a lot of this, and ultimately those who have money and or influence can sometimes just really push things in a certain direction. So I worry that if you had a whole, even in an ideal world in which everybody had spent years of their career worrying about these issues, like all of us and probably a lot of people listening, it's still really hard. But there are a lot of people who don't even understand that these are issues and who are prey to be pushed around for one reason or another because they have no idea what's at stake.
So there's a lot to unpack here. First of all, Matt, I think that, some of the policy ideas that you shared are good ones. Transparency, really thinking about a national health privacy policy law. Last I checked, the only thing that's really happening on that front is there's COPRA, the Consumer Online Privacy Rights Act, if I think I got that right. And then the ADPPA, which is the American Data Privacy Protection Act. And the ADPPA has no provisions for health privacy, none at all. The one that Senator Warren put out, it does have some really strong provisions in there that say, you can't have certain uses of data and location on your phone and things like that. So we've got all these bills swimming around. We've got on a national policy front, it seems like it's I don't know if you guys are following the hashtag hot privacy summer, but it is one hot privacy summer, scandal after scandal. And this senator and that senator is throwing out a bill and there are 6 out there and who knows what's going to happen. I really don't know what's going to happen. One of the guiding principles that we've been trying to follow, trying to tie all of this together as patients at the Light Collective, is no aggregation without representation. And what do we mean by that? We are the ones directly affected by these data sets, by these technologies. And we as patients who are going through the trauma of a new diagnosis, whether that's cancer, whether you're a man, you're a woman, you're going through an abortion, all of these things are incredibly difficult for people to understand, not only the policy landscape, what their rights are, but also how these technologies can be used against them. So how do we move forward? Well, we tend to, this is a lot of it's grounded in the Ye Patient movement. When you say no aggregation without representation, we need the people affected by these technologies to be able to represent ourselves in any dealings with the companies or the policies that are being created. We want to be able to co-design. We want to be able to make sure that there's independent validation. And we want to be able to shape policies so that there is an independent governance model that holds these companies accountable. And I don't know if we're going to get there. That's a pie in the sky idea. But one of the things we keep coming back to is no matter how virtuous a business model is, on one day, 3 years down the line, you get a new set of executive leaders, a new board. They can monetize it and sell it off however they want to. And there is no recourse for the users or the patients whose data is being gathered. So what does that tell us? As users and patients, we really have no rights, at all. No rights at all when it comes to health data that can affect our lives. And so we just kind of have to start applying the same principles of governance that work in other places. In order to create structure, you have to go to the people who are directly affected and help them, number one, understand what the harms can be, what the threat models are, and build capacity, not only to educate their own networks, their own communities, but help them to be part of the solution. If that works well, what I hope is a future where instead of terms of service that can change at any time, just because some executive says, oops, we had this nice privacy promise, we're not going to do that anymore, send out a notice to everybody. We need to have a two-sided negotiation where somebody is representing the user interest or the patient interest in any of these transactions. That doesn't exist today. We've never had that kind of representation. And I keep going back to people think, she's anti-capitalist, which he talks about surveillance capitalism. And I'm not. I'm a big fan of capitalism. The way capitalism works and markets that work well have these guardrails in place. When you buy a house, you have, 2 real estate agents negotiating with each other so that there is fairness on both sides. That happens in any transaction. We just don't think of that for patients what we do for patients is we think about individual consent and how we can minimize harm for them, number one, when they don't understand what's going on. And then we let the companies just do whatever they want. I don't think that's going to work anymore. And yes, we have 5 minutes left. Sorry.
Although, Matthew,
you're not supposed to repeat that part, Andrea. Hence the chat.
I've been enjoying this. I would love to
that's
come
great.
back.
It's fantastic, and I tell you, Jay, I mean, I hear what you're saying. It's kind of a little bit like how they run capitalism in Germany. They have like union observers on the board. Actually, Elizabeth Warren proposed something like that when presidential campaign didn't go anywhere. But that's kind of where you're going with this. Like, there should be regulation that says there should be oversight from people affected. Jail, sorry.
Yeah, so and look, I totally agree with Andrea, but I think going back to a point that Lygeia was making, I just think there's so much data being created, right? That and so much data to be created in ways that we don't even understand yet, right? That I don't know if we can always have a patient advocate there sitting around to help guide the use of that data, right? I don't know if we can always have a union representative on the board of the corporation. I think that's the concern that I have. And I think, my experience with my company, I think presents at least one model, right? So the company, I talked about a certification process that we have to use to be able to advertise on Google. The company that does that is a private company. It's called LegitScript. It's a venture-backed company. And to be able to advertise on Google and to be able to access users on Google, on the Google Ad platform, you have to provide a tremendous amount of information about your service. If you're providing an addiction recovery service, they do a pretty in-depth check on you, and then they're continuously monitoring your activities on the Google Ad platform for the year that you're certified. And what they found is that, from the pre to the post, there's been like a 77% reduction in, fraudulent recovery centers advertising on the Google Ads platform. And I think in a world where there's so much consolidation, right? I mean, like, where do you do search these days? You really only do search on Google. It's not like, there aren't that many other platforms. And I think like with credit cards, there's only like one or two big platforms for credit cards. Maybe that might be a point where you can have some control, where that all the online search activity is going through Google, and Google can implement a process that at least gets out some of the bad actors. And I don't know if you guys were watching the news today, but there's a company called MindGeek, which is the owner of Pornhub. They had their payments, both Visa and MasterCard have cut back or shut down payments on the Pornhub or MindGeek platforms because MindGeek had not been doing its work around preventing child pornography from getting on the platform. And that's basically the end of the company. They can't make money if they're not getting payments from Visa and MasterCard. So in a world where we have consolidation in the tech world, especially, and these platforms, own so much market share, maybe it is a private process that supplements the patient part of it, and maybe I'm not being very eloquent in what I'm saying here, but I think maybe it's a couple of different strategies, not just one strategy. And I'm not suggesting you were suggesting just one strategy, but it's a couple of different pain points that you can hit, that you can get from lots of nefarious activity to 95% less nefarious activity. And maybe we just have to live with the fact that we're never going to be able to control everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think anybody who would tell us that there's perfect security, perfect privacy would probably be a little bit delusional. I think those are all great ideas to explore. And, the only other thing I want to say on it's not the idea that patients need to be represented in every transaction. There can absolutely be many layers to what happens. I think that, in current corporate governance, we think about fiduciary roles just to shareholders, and that is the sole fiduciary relationship that exists in corporate governance. Mm-hmm. Fiduciaries are something that companies know very well. And those relationships don't necessarily have to be patients, but there does need to be a fiduciary role to users and patients. I think that's my point. So it could be an expert, it could be anybody else. But doctors have a fiduciary role, lawyers do. We don't have that for the data that affects our lives. So That's just a thought. And with that, I got to run.
Yeah.
And I have really enjoyed this. Thank you for inviting me.
All right. Well, look, we're right at the end of the time, so I want to quickly thank my guest today. That was Andrea Downing, head of the Light Collective. Thanks, our special guest today, from Portland, Oregon. Lygeia Ricciardi from Washington, D.C., CEO of AdaRose. You can go online and buy their fancy care packages now. They're not very nice. And John Neptune, CEO of Suntra Modern Recovery from New York City, which is probably 107 degrees with 97 humidity.
Oh, it's sticky. It's horrible here today.
As usual, but he still hasn't ever left the island. And with that, I'm Matthew Holt, the CEO, founder, head bottle washer at the Healthcare Blog. You've been listening to THCB Gang for August the 4th, 2022. Thanks a lot. We'll be back next week, August the 11th, with another great edition. So thanks for listening to us, and thanks to my guests for coming on.